Hey, I'm Alan Furstenberg,
Hi, I'm Amy Russ,
and welcome to Two Voice Devs.
two voice devs.
Amy, great to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invite.
No, it's always great to see, um, you know, more and more people who are willing to talk about what they do in this field. So why don't you, I guess, start off by introducing yourself and talking about your career path?
Sure. So, as I said earlier, my name is Amy. I have a interesting career path. I
Oh
yes.
boy.
No, I didn't want to use unconventional because I feel like that's kind of used a lot. So I'm trying to expand vocabulary, so to speak. But I thought I was going to be a diplomat. So my background is in international affairs, minored in economics, graduated with honors in economics, I minored in Japanese. So I used to be pretty fluent in undergrad. And then I went to Georgia Tech for the same thing. And I even took an internship at the Department of State, came back
Wow.
from that and said, maybe this is not for me. And it's
Okay.
great I figured it out then. The problem was I had a semester left to graduate. So I was really in a time crunch to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I would say I did the nerdiest thing in my career, which is I created a Venn diagram of the skills I had and the things I liked, overlaid it, and figured it out from there. And it turned out that data was really what I love to do.
So it turned out that building Venn diagrams was what you really like to do. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly. It was Venn diagrams that led me to think, wait, Venn diagrams help me understand data. I want to go into data, and that's what I've been in ever since. In a multitude of careers. So I have been a data engineer, not necessarily by trade, sometimes by a lot of times by accident. Data analyst, business intelligence analyst,
Mhm.
data scientist. I've been an individual contributor. I've led teams. I've basically been doing all of that and progressing in my career for 13 years this year.
That
Um,
that's
it's been an
fantastic.
interesting. It's been an interesting ride.
What is a data engineer? I'm not sure I've heard that term specifically. I've heard data scientist, but not data engineer.
So, a data engineer, you're building like the pipeline. So that's your ETL,
Hmm.
your ELT processes, that kind of thing is what I was building. And I say by accident because what tends to happen a lot of times in my cases is I'll get on a team and something will break, and I'm the only data professional there. And so they go, "Oh, well, you can fix it," and I go, "Maybe, maybe." We'll see when we get there. And so I end up fixing up their pipelines or spinning up brand new computing resources, even though that's technically speaking not my job. And then from there, they'll go, okay, now you can actually go do your job, but you still need to maintain all this other stuff until we hire someone who can do it or transition it over. So a lot of times that's a long answer, data engineer and how I kind of get into those spots, so to speak.
Okay, that makes sense. So what sort of stuff do you do these days?
So these days, I've been actually focusing on really uniting my background in international affairs and politics,
Hmm.
as well as in data into a couple of different areas. One of them is benchmarking, which I'm really excited to talk about because that's become a really interesting, fascinating place. But also writing papers, uniting policy and recommendations to different areas in data, like differential privacy, synthetic data generation, that kind of thing.
There's so much I now suddenly really want to ask you about, like discussing ethics, discussing
Mhm.
synthetic data. But I'm curious, what do you mean by benchmarking?
So yeah, so benchmarking is an interesting space. So what is a benchmark? A benchmark is when you're basically looking at something, and in our case, a lot of times is LLMs, large language models, and comparing them to another LLM in particularly what your for your use case, right? And that's really important is you're
Okay.
emphasizing for your use case because you can compare large language models for anything. But if you compare it for anything, then you're comparing it for nothing. So you really want to be specific for what you're trying to do with that large language model. Be it I want to do text to image or image to text, or maybe I'm benchmarking against if it's going to prevent harms. So, right, so preventing the LLM, or if the LLM is really good at preventing harms from occurring. So, and a harm would be giving people the tools to create weapons, so to speak, right? That would could be a harm. How well is that large language model in comparison to maybe others in preventing that kind of thing? So it doesn't just have to be technical benchmarking, it can also be societal focused benchmarking as well.
Oh, so that okay. That's now a whole another round of questions that you have me on, and I can see how you apply this to your previous history of policy and
Yes,
international
exactly.
so I feel like one of the things that I always tend to associate with benchmarking is coming up with a number or coming up with a percentage or coming up with a score. How do you do that when you're talking about policy benchmarking?
That's a great question. So you have to really, and there's technical aspects to that. You want to distill it down to a really in-depth clarity and very specific, right? And so when you're looking at that, and let's go with the example of a harm, right?
Okay.
You want to take that question and say, I want to see how well large language models um, do against preventing harms. Well, you have to, of course, define, well, what harms are you looking at? What harms, right? What laws are you trying to see if the LLM will let you break or not, right? And then
Okay.
from there, you want to give it a score, right? And if you're trying to get to a score, you want to say, well, can be yes or no. So if I put in a prompt that is actually meant to create harm, does it give me a response? If it does, that's a yes, that's bad, or it doesn't, that's a no, right? You can be that simplistic, but it gets complicated because it's not just one prompt, right? It can be a slew of prompts. And so that's where you start to go through and create different data sets for the different prompts, variety in prompts, the different harms you're testing against, and say, okay, from here, now where do we go, right? And then also the other level of complexity, is it just a text response? Do you count just the text? But what about an image?
Mm.
What about all the other modalities that a LLM could output, right? Or any other really model as well.
And then I imagine it also must be difficult because although even if you're evaluating the text that comes back, you now need to evaluate, well, okay, is this causing the harm? Is this breaking the law?
Yes.
And that's, I mean, in some cases I think that might be obvious. In others that feels like it might be kind of fuzzy and kind of
Yeah.
subject to interpretation. And
And so for example, art, right? We know art back in the 1700s or so was very different and much more open than what some people may consider to be art today. So
okay.
if I put in a request for, let's say, a nude figure, and it gives me one, right? But it's an art piece that's really well known and famous, but
Mm,
you're in possibly a state that has very strict laws around nudity. Is that breaking the law? It's a famous art piece. It's in textbooks everywhere. You can go to maybe a museum and see it there, but is that by definition breaking the law? Is where it gets kind of complicated. And so that complexity and understanding that is what makes benchmarking so interesting, but also requires a lot of people from different fields. So when I'm looking at benchmarking and understanding
mm.
benchmarking, or even working to create benchmarking with different groups of people, it's not just one or five people. It's usually 20, 30 people working together from different companies to benchmark for this particular interest.
That's really interesting. I guess I never really thought about it that way. That it does require such a large team just to create the benchmarks, because you need that diversity of perspective and that diversity of experience to be able to come together and set something up. To set up, what are the test inputs? What are the test output? What are the expected outputs for each one expected to be?
And it can even go, of course, in a lot of cases, global scale, right?
Yeah.
Because again, you have different countries who have different perspectives of what is a harm. So now you're going global. And on top of that, you want to test in different languages. So it's not just English, right? We aren't the only ones that use these models. So you may want to test in Chinese because you're possibly releasing a product in China,
Right.
right?
And at the same time, it's not like you can just say, "Oh, translate all of this English into Chinese," because again, you've got different perspectives
Mhm.
on how they might ask a question or what kinds of questions different people would ask that they might ask in a different language, a different culture, a different region that wouldn't necessarily, that wouldn't make sense if you just
Exactly.
looked at the English translation of it.
Exactly. So there's there and the funny part is, well, what we're talking about right now, that's just getting people together and coming up with what are we doing. That's not the actual honest to goodness work. Right? So we haven't talked about the format and tooling piece, right? How what do the data sets look like? Is it JSON or is it CSV? Or what are we using? Are we talking integrity and versioning? How do we do that? One of the tools I like to use is called DVC, which is data version control. Now, what does that look like? What does the prompt engineering infrastructure look like? How are we prompting and we're templating or prompt templating engines, right? What are we using here? What are we haven't even gotten to that part.
No,
We're
no.
just talking about the starting point on how we're actually going to do the benchmarking.
So let's get to that part. I think because one of the things that I think a lot of people who are, and I include myself in this to be absolutely clear, naively coming into the AI field with prompts, and we're like, oh, I've been coding for X number of years. I'll just put my prompts in my code and my code in my version control, and I've got a test suite. I know how to run a test suite. Um, I feel like there's a whole other world out there that has already tackled some of these problems that you've been working in that we need to be learning from.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point is that a lot of the tools that are out there can be used to do this work, but you're using them in a slightly different way. So for
Hmm.
example, when we're looking at integrity and versioning, common integrity and versioning that you hear about is checksums and validation schemas, right? We would do that here too to implement that data integrity checks. And the data integrity for here though is going to be your prompts, right? So
Right.
that way, again, we're using a very common thing that you hear in data set handling now, just the data is a little bit different, right? It's not a database or a row in a column or a row in a table. It's your documents, your JSONs, your CSVs that contain your prompts. So that's where it kind of gets really interesting as well. And that's also reason why you want to do great documentation. I love the documentation, right? When you're using these and making these decisions alongside your code, because you want to be reproducible. Because that's the important part is that once you do this exercise, you want others to reproduce it. Or in some cases, let's say you're notifying a really big, well known company that, hey, your model is pretty bad. You want them to be able to reproduce what you've done so that they can fix it, right? So a lot of these
Mm.
companies who create these models will take your prompts and your output and then attempt to redo it, right? Get the same response and then fix it, which is really what in regards to benchmark, what you're trying to do is
I,
to catch attention to these things and get them fixed.
I kind of worry almost the flip side of that though is that, and maybe this is a question, how much are you concerned with a model developer then tuning to the benchmark? So they take
Mm,
your test questions and feed them in as part of the training itself.
that's a great question and a great point. So, what ends up happening a lot of times, what I've done, and when I've worked with other groups, what they've done is they only release a certain number of those prompts to the public, right? So
Okay.
that way you're not tuning correctly to your point to the prompts itself. You're you're going to fine tune to a certain number of them, but not all of them, right? But again, the entire point is to notify you that hey, maybe out of 10,000 prompts, you release 5,000 and your model did poorly on more than half of them. And here's the ones where unfortunately it did not do well. Based on this context, you should be able to start to fine tune.
So I guess you're using some of them to point them in the right direction,
Mhm.
but still expecting them to do the improved tuning on their own. And
Exactly.
and I guess kind of trusting that they're not just going to take those bad results, feed them in as the training, and say we did it.
Exactly.
How
Right.
much
And
do you see that the
um
test fudging like that?
it's not often because what prevents me or prevents that from kind of happening is not just the limited number of prompts that are released, but also the fact that benchmarking is kind of continuous,
Mm.
right? So once it's done, quote unquote, you go from version 1 to version maybe 1.5 to version 2, and you're consistently testing. And that's why we use a lot of prompt template engines. So Ginger 2 is one. You can do custom solutions where you can take maybe that original data set prompt that in our
Mm.
example was 10,000 and then customize it, make it a little bit different, and then use it again to test for the next benchmark, right? For 1.5, and you continue that process. And that's actually a core part of versioning your entire code base as well.
Okay, so so in a sense you're creating. Well, I was about to say you're creating synthetic data, but the data is all kind of synthetic. You're creating all of the test prompts as part of this group, correct?
Yeah, so
Or
the test prompts are
okay,
created, but they're created by people, right?
okay,
So you're generally how it works is you get people to create maybe 20 to 30 test prompts, generally speaking. And then from there, you'll use again that prompt template engine to then take that and say, okay, split this out, and that's where synthetic data comes in into X number of prompts, right? And they'll build that up, and then you continue to reiterate through that for different versions.
I got to say it's fascinating that you're talking about prompt template engines because this seems like one of those things that seems obvious to me, and yet I rarely hear about it discussed. It seems like everyone is saying, you're just going to take a prompt and you'll, splice stuff together as a string, right? And it seems
Yeah.
like, I mean, it sounds like what you're describing is not a lot more sophisticated than that, but at least a little more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, you're right. To a point, it's a little bit more sophisticated, but it's not necessarily too hard. It's almost as if I would compare prompt engineering or prompt template engine very similar to how you do random numbers,
Mm,
right? So you can code something to create a random number. And so you'll maybe start off and say, okay, I want this to say random numbers, odd numbers, blah, blah, blah. And then it continues to run that code, right? It's very similar to that. You'll create a couple of prompts, and then you can say, I want you to dynamically create prompts that are focused in maybe this harm in our example, or in this harm, right? So you're doing the same thing, but you're just doing it for a prompt, which is super useful because you want a good, robust set of prompts to test when you're benchmarking.
So this may sound a little bit silly, but it sounds like what you're saying is you are now using another LLM to create the prompts for the testing.
Right. But
Okay.
then going back to that point of what we were talking about earlier about having a variety of people, you're going to, of course, review
Okay.
a sample of those that were already created to make sure, okay, is this actually going back to when we discuss benchmarking for your use case? Does it actually match the use case, right? Are we actually, do this prompt make sense for this use case? Or when you brought up the point about languages, does this prompt make sense in that language for this use case?
Okay. So what other sorts of tools are there that, along the lines of prompt template engines that are invaluable when you're creating these benchmarks and trying the benchmarks out?
Yeah, so when it comes to tools that we use, again, some of them are very, I think, common. Scikit-learn is a great one for metrics implementation. We also use things like Hugging Face. Not saying I'm not sponsored by Hugging Face. Don't work at Hugging Face, but they do provide really good standards for implementation as well.
Okay.
We also look at different like nuances in regards to the prompts. Like, do we tokenize differences? Perhaps. Do we use case sensitivity? So if you type in all caps for the same prompt versus normal case, does that get through to the LLM?
Oh,
Right. And so we'll use tools to test and to create prompts that look like that and test that as well, too, or write it in code.
that's one of those things I'd never thought about.
Yes. We think about so many different aspects around prompts that I dream about it sometimes, unfortunately, because I'm going, oh, I could do lowercase, or I could do alternating case, or maybe all case, or maybe 50% of that prompt should be uppercase and the other should be normal case. Does that work? Does that work? It's a lot of thinking of those things to see how people would, in a way, in our example, kind of either break the LLM, or if you're testing for like accuracy, it doesn't matter if it's uppercase, lowercase, or alternating case.
Mm.
If you ask the same question, do you get the same response? Is it an accurate response?
It
Right?
it kind of occurs to me, and I feel like something about what we just said just made this click a little bit. That this is a lot like what I would call in the traditional programming world, testing or quality assurance or QA.
Mhm.
How much does how much does this differ from that?
So when it comes to differing from QA, it can be actually an interesting and important aspect of QA. But the thing about QA and quality assurance is that generally speaking, quality assurance wouldn't create a benchmark. They could use it and they would have to understand how it was created. But you can imagine quality assurance professionals are looking at a slew of things ensuring quality. So
I
having them spend all this time to create a benchmark, because benchmarking can take months, by the way, is probably not the most efficient use of their time, but they would be experts in understanding how that benchmark was created and then using that as a part of maybe creating documentation or reports around quality.
okay, I guess part of where my question came from was more along the lines of QA. The common task of QA is coming up with good tests and good evaluation criteria for those tests and for the code that they're getting. Whereas it sounds like the benchmarking team is coming up with good benchmarks and good evaluation criteria
Right.
for those. So it's not, they're not the same,
But
but it sounds like they're parallel,
they
similar
are.
tasks.
Exactly. So, okay, so the way you're describing, yes, they're very much parallel. And what I've found is that people who do really good in quality, QA, could be really good in benchmarking.
Okay.
But again, that's that point we made before is having that variety of experience. So you want people who have quality assurance background, you want people who have technical backgrounds, you want people who have the policy backgrounds, you want people who are from, let's say, you're testing and benchmarking in Latin America. You, of course, want people who are from Latin America on your team, right? Because they would know in that particular country how this would work,
Right. And
right? So you want this variety of experience and exposure.
so you want people who have the domain knowledge for whatever it is that this model is expected to work in, but also broader knowledge and narrower knowledge. The very diverse set of knowledge and skills that apply to it. I guess that actually kind of goes to, again, thinking about the parallels with QA. One of the things about testing is it's very Boolean. We kind of, did it pass the test? Yes, no. The test is a discrete test. It's, you test for these numbers, these values. It's easy to set up programmatic tests like that. What kind of tools do you have to do the same kind of benchmark evaluations? Because there you're dealing with things that are a lot fuzzier in some cases.
So when it comes to benchmarking evaluations, you definitely want a combination of human evaluation. So, and that's going to be looking at to the
Hmm.
point of culture, right? How culturally significant it is. So you want that group of people. You also want to look at I would say, the common metrics in regards to things like confusion. Your rogue score is a good one that we look at as well, which is a great way to understand if it's passing the benchmark, but also that very common yes or no, right? As well. And all that will combine on a scale that again has to be agreed on by everyone. That, okay, where does this particular tool that we're benchmarking, this model, this LLM that we're benchmarking, where does it sit on that scale? And so that's
Okay.
another aspect of this whole conversation is you've got 40 people perhaps on your team to benchmark and you all have to agree on a scale.
How difficult is it to establish that kind of a scale?
Um,
Especially
I,
when you're dealing with a team of
yeah,
40 people.
it can be difficult that first time. That's the hardest part is getting version point 0.5 out, right? That beginning version. Once that's done, the scale is pretty set. And I would say the difficulty level is about an 8.
Hmm.
But once that one's done,
Hmm.
everything else as it repeats is pretty smooth sailing, so to speak. As long as you stay really well organized in that first version and you continue on and you have really good established practices, you have a great GitHub repo where people can pull information, you have again those operational processes in place.
Well,
So you're good.
for somebody who's just getting started in the field in general, um, how would you recommend they get into benchmarking?
That's a good question. I would say there are organizations that are actually really heavily involved that need volunteers. Because I see last cherry on top of this is most people don't get paid to do this, right? You're doing this
Interesting.
because you feel that you want to make sure technology is helping people. And so this is one way to do that is getting that information out there to people who would use these kinds of models. And so when I'm doing benchmarking, I'm working with teams, I'm actually volunteering right now. That's it, right? I'm doing this for time out of my time. So I
How
would definitely say you could look for organizations that are doing that. There's one that's doing it right now called Machine Learning Commons. They do a really great one. That's actually really interesting. It does focusing on harms, which is what we were talking about before. You could start there. There's also, if you look up benchmarking organizations, there's been some really interesting papers that have been printed on benchmarking and the organizations behind that. And then you can just email them and say, hey, I'd love to volunteer to help. They would love the help. They need the help.
That's fascinating. This is an aspect I hadn't even considered. So, how many of these benchmarking criteria? I mean, what do we call them? We call them benchmarking criteria or benchmarking models or benchmarks? I guess
Yeah, just
benchmarks.
benchmarks. I think it's going to
Okay.
be best for now.
So, how many of these benchmarks are open benchmarks?
Most benchmarks are open.
Interesting. Okay.
So, and that's because you want it to be reproducible and you want people to see it. But now, in regards to having it open in the sense of you get all the prompts, that's a different thing because again, you don't want to fine tune to prompts, right?
Right.
But no one's hiding a benchmark unless you've done poorly at it, which is then when I would be concerned. Right? If you're a user and you're looking for a good benchmark for a particular model and you can't find anyone that's benchmarked them or any benchmarks they've released, I would question the efficacy of that model, right? Because what are you hiding if you aren't willing to be necessarily benchmarked? That's a me thing. Some people are okay with that. They don't decide that as a criteria. I consider that to be an important criteria when I look at implementations, and what I want to use is, okay, how do you compare to others, which is a benchmark? Where can I find that? And then how do I verify that, as well as who else has tested it, and do you all those tests align, right? Do all those different tests that people have done for a benchmark align with what I'm seeing?
I guess the flip side of that question is also if I'm building a model, where
Mhm.
do I go looking for benchmarks to run it against, and how do I run it against those benchmarks?
That's a great question. So I would say it of course would depend on your use case. So if you're wanting, like, for example, when we were talking about harms, ML
Yeah.
Commons is a great one for harms.
Okay.
If you're doing for, you can look for benchmarks for image to text, and there are some really good ones out there. And some of them are actually automated. And they've created
Oh
an
wow.
app where you can say, hey, this is the model I want to use. Here's the input. Here's the like the model who made it, benchmark it against this, and it will run and actually give you a benchmark, right? How well does it perform?
So
Which
it
is
comes
really
out
cool.
and gives you a score,
It gives you a
basically.
score. Yeah.
Wow. Very cool. Okay. I there is so much that I want to now cover and explore and go off on, but I think we've covered benchmarking pretty well, and at least I hope that folks now have a better idea of if you're building a model, if you're fine tuning a model, where and how and why you should go and benchmark your model. I mean, I guess this even holds true for if you're fine tuning an existing model, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. You should be always, in my mind, benchmarking what you're using because against your use case, emphasizing the use case, because you always
Right.
want to use, to the extent you can, the best model or LLM for your use case, right? Such that you're doing, in my mind, that's less work, right? Because if I've benchmarked something, I picked the best one, now I can focus on fine tuning and not be so concerned with, okay, is this thing actually good enough for text to image? And if it's not as good as I want it to be, now I've got to finesse it, so to speak, right? To get it to where I want it to be. But if I benchmark and I got a great one, then I don't have to do that stuff. And I can focus on my use case and getting something into production.
And it also occurs to me that if I'm building an application, not trying, I don't want to build a model. I want to go use a foundation model that's out there already,
Mhm.
or that it behooves me to learn more about benchmarking because this is the way that I can figure out which is the best model for my application.
Exactly.
For my kinds of inputs, for my topic area, for dealing with my data. We talk sometimes about saying, make sure you find the right model and you tune your prompts against that model, but we don't say how to find that model.
Exactly. And this is one way to do that, right? This is one way to get a criteria for that model such that you're now prepared and able to move forward for your application.
Well, this has been fantastic, Amy. I really hope that people now have a better sense on why they should be using uh, benchmarking, how to do benchmarking, what kind of benchmarks are out there. If folks want to learn more, where can they learn more and where can they follow you?
Yeah, sure. So you can learn more first by following me. I'm a predominantly on LinkedIn.
Okay,
I don't really have any other social media. I find that LinkedIn takes enough time on top of everything I'm doing right
tell
now.
me about it.
I just yeah, I just don't have a lot of time to build anything else. I'm on LinkedIn. Just look for Amy Russ or Amy Michelle Russ. So I'll be there. I'm pretty obvious. I think this video gives you a good perspective of what I look like. So you'll have my headshot. Outside of that, if you're really interested in learning about benchmarks, so there's some really good articles that I recommend. IBM has a good one for benchmarking. So does NVIDIA has a great one for benchmarking as well. Those would be good places to start. I would also go to bring up Machine Learning Commons a lot because they're the ones I know that do really great benchmarking. They published a couple of papers on that, as well as worked with different organizations to do different types of benchmarking across different modalities. And so that could be a good organization to look into as you focus on trying to understand benchmarking. You don't have to get involved, but they have a lot of good content out there for you to look into.
Okay, great. So folks can reach out to you on LinkedIn. Feel free to comment below if you've got thoughts of your own on benchmarking, and we will have you back, I'm sure, to discuss some other topics or discuss benchmarking some more on
Sure.
Two Voice Devs.
On Two Voice Devs.
Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.